Today's episode is sponsored by newspapers.com, the largest online newspaper archive. Find your ancestor in the paper with a quick search on newspapers.com. Your family didn't need to be famous to appear in the papers. Start with the obituaries, marriage announcements, and birth announcements. Then go beyond to explore the local news, classified ads, photos, and more. Search through more than 760 million newspaper pages from across the US, UK, Canada, and beyond in just seconds. Everyone, welcome to Genealogy Adventures. I'm Brian Sheffy.
And I'm Donya Williams. Good evening. It's a nice, pretty, crisp day today. What do you think, Brian?
It is. It was a perfect day all around.
Yeah, it is. It is. So I want to go right into this. I want to say hi to everybody, to AE, that's one of my girls, and to Jane Mackle and Michelle. Hey guys, I want to say hi to you guys. And we have a great show lined up for you today. And I want to introduce to you Andi Cumbo-Floyd. Her name is Andi Cumbo-Floyd. And Andi is a writer, historian, and mom who lives in Virginia's Southwest Mountains. She has been honored with the opportunity to research several enslaved communities in the area and to get to know the descendants of those incredible, perseverant individuals. To find out more about Andi, you can actually go to www.andilit.com. Welcome to the show, Andi.
Thank you for having me.
We're excited.
Indeed. Welcome to the show. So happy to have you back because we actually had you on before to talk about the work that you were contributing to about Scotchtown, which is in Virginia, which was a great show. I don't remember the season, but it's on YouTube, and everyone should check that out because it's an amazing project. And again, that was an early project for its period. You know, people actually looking at an entire enslaved community, documenting them, and then trying to find their descendants. So that was awesome. So that was actually a nice mixture of both history and genealogy.
Definitely was, definitely.
So what's that journey been like for you? Did you start off, what did you start off as first, a historian, a genealogist, and how did those two things come together?
I started off as a historian. I have a bachelor's degree, no graduate degrees in history, but a bachelor's degree in history. And the story of how I came to do this work is sort of a strange one. I grew up on a plantation here in Virginia. My dad was the caretaker. And I kind of just grew up knowing about the people who had been enslaved there. I didn't really know much about them. I didn't know a lot of the history of anybody that had lived there. But when my mom got sick and I came home to take care of her, my dad said, what do you want to do? And I said, I want to write a book. And I decided to write about the people who had been enslaved at this plantation called Bremo. And that became this sort of strange blend of history and genealogy that I do still now. I'm working with a plantation called Birdwood here in Charlottesville to do the same thing, where I'm trying to kind of capture the storyline from both directions, which is kind of how I think of the difference between history and genealogy, right? History kind of comes from the past and moves forward, and genealogy kind of comes from now and moves backwards. But I think you need both to be able to tell the story of any place or any group of people.
Mm-hmm. And actually, it was almost Bremo that was our first point of contact, because I've got deep ancestry both there and up and down the whole James River and its surrounding area. But there's an interesting part of your double-barreled surname, which is Cumbo, and we had a connection through that one too.
Yeah.
So would you like to explain?
Sure, yeah. Almost all of the Cumbos in the United States are African American people, because we all descend from a man named Emmanuel Cambo, who was one of the 1619 Africans who came over at Jamestown. Emmanuel was never enslaved in the formal codified way we think of it. He was an indentured servant in that sense. So he ended up being free and buying 50 acres of land in James City County, Virginia. And so my 3 times great grandfather crossed the color line in the early 20th century, which is how my family came to identify as white. But all my cousins are Black folks, and it's like one of my favorite parts of my family story.
Mm-hmm. Where my ancestor also paused for white, but went down to Northampton County, North Carolina, and assumed the name Coombe because he felt that was a little too close to Cumbo. Not a great difference, but that was another one of our connections. So, Donya, did you want to encapsulate did you actually want to bring up that website with that paragraph about genealogists versus historians? Because I thought it would be a nice way to frame the discussion, because maybe it's a perception thing from my part, but there seems to be, and I'm going to have 2 analogies, there seems to be a tension between professional genealogists and historians. And sometimes people may say that professional genealogists are being defensive because we're being perceived to be less than. And the analogies I'm going to use are, it's like the advertising world and the marketing world. Advertisers need marketers, but for whatever reason, there is a tension between advertising and marketing because advertisers have a perception of being more elite. And for people who are still in the communication industry, the same thing with public affairs people and public relations people. Public affairs just has that kind of elitist kind of vibe to it. I'm not saying that everyone who works in those fields think that they're elitist, but there is the perception that somehow public affairs is better than PR. You see that even reflected in salaries. And that's kind of what I see going on with historians versus genealogists. What's your kind of take on that?
So here's the site that Brian was talking about. And basically, I will share the link to it. It's a long link, so I'll try to shorten it later. But basically,
and I just want to caveat, this is an old article. This was written in 2013.
Right. Oh, where are you going? Okay. So basically, as you can see, it's called A Historian Among Genealogists Working on Who Do You Think You Are? This is this particular article. And it says that we historians, however, have a somewhat uneasy relationship to genealogists. We jump back in time and write a story that largely depends on a linear narrative. For historians, chronology is everything in contrast. Genealogists start in the present and then work backwards incrementally through time. Their currency is demographic information, names, birth and death dates, and marriages, and the historical narrative sometimes seems secondary to identifying particular individuals. So,
yeah, I had a couple of comments about that. Meaning, whether you're working from the past to the present or the present to the past, you're still working in a chronological way. And I was joking with Andi and Donya in the green room, going, I can't get to my 3 times great grandparents until I had correctly identified my 2 times great grandparents. I can't just jump from my great grandparents to my 3 times.
And even if you know their name, even if you know their birth dates or their or their names or what have you, and don't know somebody else's, you still have to go follow the line. So you're still going in a chronological order.
Right. Yeah, I think that's I think that feels to me like grasping at straws to try to belittle genealogy a little bit, because it's a little different focus and a little different methodology. But honestly, like, it was only after you guys asked me to come talk about this that I tried to sort of codify the difference, because I just don't really think about them as being that much different, I guess.
So what do you think the difference is between a historian and a genealogist?
Yeah, for me, I think it is somewhat just moving forward if you're moving from history, and moving backwards if you're moving from genealogy, but I'm not even willing to like stake a lot in those kind of qualifications. I think sometimes with history it can be a little bit more place oriented, or even idea oriented. Like you might be looking at modernism as a movement, right, in history, whereas genealogy tends to be tied to people, but it doesn't have to be either, right? Like the kind of genealogical work I do always deals with people, but it deals with people in a particular place, right? Like if I don't know that everyone is enslaved at Birdwood, then I'm not there. Those people are kind of beyond my purview. There's a place that's holding all those people together. So I don't know. I just feel like those distinctions are just not particularly helpful, I guess. And like I said in the green room, I just don't think hierarchies, especially for this kind of thing, make any sense at all. I don't know why what it does for anybody, for them to make us better or worse than anybody else. So.
Okay. And again, for me, history and genealogy are kind of intertwined in as much as I look at genealogy as looking at history in microcosm, right there at the individual level, individual family levels, and sometimes like a community like Edgefield or Wythe County, Virginia, where everyone's related to everyone else, an entire county. Whereas I look at history as the big sweeping arc of basically change. You know, things are happening, changes are happening, and that's affecting the decisions or things that happen to my family. It helps me understand what's happening to them in a better way. And I've got a couple of examples for that. It's like researching free people of color in the northern part of North Carolina, so Warren County, Halifax County, Northampton, right up there along that Virginia border. Why all of a sudden I was finding them very difficult to find after about 1820, 1830, specifically after the Nat Turner Revolt. Well, it's because they were setting up places like the Roberts Settlement in Ohio and Indiana and Illinois. They were getting out of Dodge because after that revolt in specifics, life became very difficult for them in North Carolina. And it wouldn't have occurred to me until I actually sat down and started reading both about Nat Turner, the revolts, the aftermath, and what was happening to free people of color in Southern Virginia and Northern North Carolina. They were getting out of Dodge. So that whenever I lose track of people around that time, I immediately know I've got to go probably to Ohio, Indiana, Illinois. Oh, and Michigan was the other one. In Michigan, to start picking up the trail for them. Conversely, using my white ancestors, until I started reading the history books, I didn't realize that swathes of Kentucky and Tennessee were actually part of Virginia. Virginia was huge up until around the Revolutionary War, and then it started getting parceled out. And then once I understood that, I understood why some of my families were really hard to find. It's not that they migrated from Virginia to Kentucky. They were always there. It was just what that place where they were called changed. Wouldn't have known that without history, but genealogy is what made me look at that to begin with.
Exactly.
Right. Yeah, I think of it too, like because my specialty is the study of enslaved communities, right? So if you don't know that the international slave trade was banned in the early 19th century, then it's hard to understand why they codified the law that an enslaved person's status came from their mother. You know, and but that matters because then you know that any children born on that plantation are staying there unless they're specifically sent away, because that is how enslavers grew their enslaved population. They couldn't buy them as easily anymore, so now they raised them, right? So to be a little less than ugly about it, but that matters. That historical context matters for why you're not seeing, you know, once 1810, 1812 roll around, these big additions to enslaved populations. They're growing more by population growth. And if you don't know that, then it's hard to kind of look at the genealogies and see why people are there and why they're not there.
Right. I mean, I want to say this to you. Don't be ashamed to use the word breeder, because that's what she was saying as far as in a not an ugly way, but we want people to really understand, because a lot of folks, particularly Caucasians, do not believe that breeding actually existed. And that's yet another part and form of history that is not taught, but it's history, and we would not have learned about it had we not done the research as genealogists. So it's really funny that they show they try to make the difference, saying that a genealogist is just a family researcher. That's it. But we're not. In my opinion, I think that there's actually a difference between a genealogist and a family researcher. In my opinion, I actually think there's a difference between those two people, as opposed to being a difference between a genealogist and a historian. I see them as being somewhat the same, as opposed to a family researcher and a genealogist.
And I'm going to go one step further, going back to 1619, because again, there's so much partial information, misinformation about that group of people. First of all, there was more than 20 of them, for starters. And basically, I'm standing on the shoulders of researchers and writers like Catherine Knight and Rick Murphy, who have written awesome books about our collective ancestors. And if you really want to understand the Black experience in this country and how awful it was, Andi was right. They were never slaves. They were never enslaved. They were either like indentured servants or bonded servants. All of them, bar one, poor Peter George, were able to buy themselves out of their bonds and their children out of their bonds. But then what did the burghers of Virginia decide to do? And these people saved Jamestown. That's the point that I was going to make. I forgot Jamestown was on the verge of starvation and disease again for the second or third time. It was on the verge of failing because they had a lot of people who didn't have skills, so they couldn't grow food, they couldn't rear animals, they were sickly. The Native Americans, the Powhatan, were just sick of them by this point. These 30-something people showed up, saved a colony because they could grow food and they could rear animals, and they worked out how to do it in an environment that was completely foreign to them. What did the burghers decide to do after they were freed? Introduce slavery. Oh, we need people like that, but instead of offering Africans a chance of coming over here to live like anyone else, no, we're going to buy them and ship them over. And that's the discussion this country needs to have. But because there's so much information about them, people keep reacting to the word slavery. They kind of miss that point.
Yeah. And I mean, and that's a whole conversation about that. We existed as a nation for a few decades before we codified this. And that's something we don't talk about. And like you said, there's a reason we codified it. And there's a reason we codified it based on skin color. And that's because it's easy. It's just easy to see when somebody looks a certain way, and so, yeah, I agree with you. And that's the stuff that historians and genealogists can do together to figure out, right? And I would only know as much as I do about the Africans that came in 1619 because they're my ancestors. If I hadn't done my genealogy, I wouldn't have a very popular knowledge of that. What Nicole Hannah-Jones did was amazing, but that would be the limit of my knowledge, and so that's genealogy brought me that information.
And again, with works from, like I said, Catherine Knight and Rick Murphy, I had no idea the volume of information that was available about those Angolans who were in Jamestown, that there were court cases, plural, more than one. Because you read white historians and American ones, they're like, oh, no one knows their names, not that much is known about them, there's nothing about them in the records. And these two authors, who are, yes, they're my cousins, but they're awesome anyway, just blew that out of the water with these, because their books just have sources and citations and who and where the records are, where they found them. That there's even more records out there that they didn't have time to access because they, like, you're a writer, you know what those publishing deadlines are like. They had to get the books out. So again, another interesting intersection of history and genealogy.
So we have a question from Gina Lewis, and she said, where is a family researcher placement in the scope? I think that's supposed to say in the scope, or it says, is the scope of this conversation? You spoke briefly on the term. I guess she's talking about what I said. So basically, Gina, I feel like, and again, this is my opinion. Please know that it's not like it's an actual definition that's written out or anything. And Brian and Andi can definitely chime in. But in my opinion, a family researcher literally only talks about their family. They want to know who grandma, granddaddy is, and they may go back to great grandma and great granddad on every side. But what they don't do is start to learn what they actually had to go through to be, what their environment was, what it was that they were living in, what it was, what type of monetary issues that they were in, that they were facing. What they didn't go into, what it was that they were learning in the process of growing up and having these kids in this particular situation, while having these kids being in this situation. Family researchers don't want that information. They just want to know who they were, and that's it. That's my opinion of a family researcher, the difference between a family researcher and a genealogist. Andi, what is yours?
Yeah, that's interesting. I hadn't thought of it that way, but I think that's true. And I think there's a level of a scope that a family researcher has that tends to be very focused on their family, maybe even if they go back a few more generations, but it is really just like, what's my line? It's like the way my grandfather, my Cumbo grandfather, did genealogy, which is just to look back and kind of prove who he was. That's what he wanted to know. And it's almost it's like a hobby thing too. I think there's a different scope in that than it is in somebody who's a professional genealogist who is trying to research a large family group, but also look at how that family group intersects with other family groups. And because, we all know once you get past a couple grandparents, you're talking about dozens and hundreds and sometimes thousands of people. So.
Mm-hmm. Well, I guess my take on it is someone who does a really kind of deep dive on a specific family. So it could be multiple generations. Normally, I guess the ones that I can remember the best are the ones that are centered around a theme, like the military service of the West family or the pioneering spirit of the Boone family going from Virginia all the way out to Washington State. It's always kind of dressed up in not dressed up, but kind of wrapped up in a kind of quirk or a characteristic or a theme. And then they just pull that out every single generation. But in that, let's say so-and-so may have had 12 kids, and out of those 12 kids, they may have focused on 3 and then go down to the next generation. So I guess I'm kind of falling in between the two of you. Deep dive, but on a specific family kind of line, rather than looking at allied families, or families in the extended family tree.
I mean, it doesn't have the person's name. It just says Facebook user. It is your right to disagree, and that is really fine. I'm really fine with that. I personally have never met a family researcher to go into detail the way that I was describing. Those people tend to think of themselves as genealogists, not as just a family researcher. I kind of agree with also Jerome, because Jerome stated that, he says he likes adding geography to the genealogy and history picture, and it makes a difference. If you do not study, and this was something that we had to learn about the area that we researched, for Edgefield. If you do not study the times that these places came to pass, you're going to give wrong information. Point blank. My grandfather was not born in Greenwood, South Carolina, but that's what my mother knew. I use him as an example every time because she said, oh, my daddy was born in Greenwood. Well, I'm looking for this man in Greenwood, and Greenwood wasn't even in existence. So if it's not in existence when he was born in 1894 and it didn't come to pass until 1897, if you don't go into the geography of that particular area that you're researching, you are going to be lost and you're not going to get the right information. If a family researcher is not going to do something like that and they're just following the names, then it'll never come to pass.
Also, different regions were organized in a different way. I am very, very painfully new to researching in the Midwest, specifically amongst Native American records. And they're freedmen, the African Americans that were held by the civilized tribes. And that was a completely different, everything from probate records to, land records were kind of still, they're still similar, and plat maps are still similar. But in terms of the bureaucracy, what was being produced, when it was being produced by, all of that stuff was it's different. It's just completely different. And even still to this day, how the states handle vital records, they're not necessarily easy to get a hold of. Much different, they're noticeably more different than, say, my experience of Virginia, anywhere in New England. New York can still be a bit tricky too, but Midwest can be tricky to get records, even for your great grandparents.
Right.
Yeah, and I would add to that geography comment too. The land matters. Again, because I focus on enslaved people, the plantations west of where I live in Virginia they're not plantations like Thomas Jefferson's Monticello, because they don't have agricultural land out there. It's very different. You can't sustain an enslaved population of 150 people when you have 2 arable acres of land to grow on, right? So that, knowing that kind of placement makes a difference in, what do you know about what your great-great-grandparents did? What were their jobs? I was doing some research for a plantation south of Charlottesville here, and I got to meet some of the descendants, which was so cool, right? It turns out they're still doing the jobs that their enslaved ancestors did. Masons, teachers, those jobs tend to pass down, but none of them are farmers because the plantation didn't have enough agricultural land to sustain growing anything beyond just, a little bit of corn and some cattle.
Mm-hmm.
So that's true with my father's.
That's true with my father's Sheppy people in Wythe County and Smith County in Southwest West Virginia. Again, the enslaving family, they had the small farms, but they were either tradesmen, they enslaved tradespeople, but their wealth came from saltpeter, salt mines, lead mines, which are all up in the kind of lower Appalachians where they were. That's where they made their money from. And again, it was local history books that brought that to my attention, which brings me to the next segment. Local history books and genealogists. I don't know if there's as much tension between local genealogists and historians as there are on the national stage, and I kind of see them being almost at that level, being one and the same kind of person. But what frustrates me eternally about local history books is when I'm researching my Caucasian ancestors and families, they're amazing because everyone's documented. Even, don't mean to make fun of it, little Sally, who died at the age of 10, she gets a mention. No non-white people get mentioned unless it was an enslaved person who did something heroic, unless it was a native, an attack of indigenous people on someone, on a town or whatever. That's when they tend to get mentioned. And I just find that really frustrating. And I find it's a lost opportunity.
I'm used to us not being mentioned, and I'm used to, and I hate to say it like that, but I without going into the stuff that's going on with Kanye West and the White Lives Matter and all that other stuff, I talking with Brian, I feel like we're only mentioned when it fits on a negative realm, and that's an issue for me. So I mean, regardless of if the person is sick or not, we're not thought of as sick. We're just automatically thought of as criminals, whether any of those things. So this has been going on since the beginning of time, and this actually is history, what we're talking about right now. And you don't learn that unless you're doing that kind of research to figure out I'm not being discussed and I should have been.
It's just frustrating for me because we know that they were there. And then I have a possible solution that I want to come to come out of this with a positive. The other thing that frustrates my soul is a lot of us who have roots in the old 96 district in South Carolina have varying degrees of Asian, specifically Chinese DNA. So there were clearly Chinese people in or around or near the old 96 district in South Carolina. But because in colonial South Carolina in the early republic, if you weren't white, you were black. There was no distinction made. You were either white or you were black. So if you were black, it didn't matter if you were Middle Eastern, Southeast Asian, Chinese, whatever. You were just all lumped together. And no one's actually written about that. Because trust me, for a historian to write that, I would be the first one to buy the book because I would be looking for names and clues.
And not only did nobody listen,
you should write the book, that, Brian.
Yes, he should. But not only does nobody write about that, let's think about when what's his name? Curtis Jackson, also known as 50 Cent, when he did his VH1 version of his tracing his ancestry back, he actually was he goes back into where our family is from and is possibly more than likely definitely related to my family through the Brooks line. And when he went back and he was visiting I think it was the Red Shirt Museum or what have you, and the woman was telling him, oh yeah, you're a part of which Chinese group was that? It wasn't Vikings. It was
no, it was Manchurians.
Yes.
Mongolians. Mongolians. That was it.
She kept telling him, "You're Mongolian. Yeah, you need to learn your history. It's Mongolian." People laughed at that, but then later on, we started to find out she was right. She was literally telling the right thing. She was telling the story that there were Mongolians in Edgefield. This is why I got shaky eyes, people. This is what my
I
eyes.
don't think you really wanted to say it that way, but well.
Okay.
Don't let that
all right. Go. I'm sorry, but this is why my eyes slant. Is that better? Yes. I don't mean to offend anyone.
Some of our family do have distinctive. Even again, my Edgefieldian descendant Munn's family in DC, we have recognizably not. Some of us have recognizably Asian features.
Right, and and then to turn around and see that I have Asian DNA, a good percentage. It may be double digit if I'm remembering correctly, because I've been messing with it today, but it may be a double digit. But the fact is, the slant of my eyes didn't just come out of nowhere. It just didn't. And I apologize if I offended anybody, but nevertheless, y'all know me, y'all know my mouth, y'all know I love everybody. So, but nevertheless, it's that particular thing.
And again, for her to have said that on that episode, and I wish I could remember the lady's name, and I think she was the curator or something to do with that museum. Mm-hmm. She had no hesitation in calling that information out. So she clearly knew it. But I can't find it. I'd love to find her to find out where she found out about that information. But again, that's one of those intersections where genealogy and history can be really fascinating. And what I'm hoping might come out of this is I have a lot of hope for the younger generation. I'm sure my parents' generation had hopes for mine. But, I think that's true no matter how many generations you go. But I have faith in the younger generation that maybe younger historians and genealogists can come together to rewrite at least local history books to make them more inclusive. Because, as well as the fact that there were non-Caucasian people living in these places, this whole LGBTQ thing, that's culture war that's going on, that's nothing new. People like that always existed. They existed in the communities just alongside everyone else. To make to make local histories more inclusive, and by extension, make people hop on and disagree with me if you want, but actually make history more interesting. You can imagine, kids sitting in classrooms actually reading something or being recommended to visit a website or do genealogy, that they can see people that they can recognize in themselves. That's a powerful thing.
Yes, it is.
Yeah, it is a powerful thing. Representation matters. I mean, it's also just the truth, right? Like, it's just the truth of what the history is. So like at Bremo, there's a road there called Teepee Town. There's nothing written about Teepee Town Road. The Native Americans from that area didn't live in teepees. Like, it doesn't make any sense that that name is named that. Well, it turns out there was a placement settlement there when they were building the power plant. And so a lot of Native American people from a lot of tribes ended up living there. And that's where the name came from. But I only know that because my dad talked to an old timer that knew that down the road. That's not something that a historian would necessarily find in some sort of documentary research, right? That's the kind of thing genealogists learn because we talk to the people in the community. So, but those people stayed. And so I have a whole lot of neighbors from that part of Virginia who have tribal ties to lots of tribes all across the United States because they were part of this community that came to do this particular work for this particular time.
So then let me ask you this question, Andi. What do you what do you, when you said you have your BA in history in our in the green room, we were talking before the show. I mean, what do you feel like as far as history is concerned, and how do you feel that? Why do you think they separate the two? Learning what you know, learning how you learned it in school. Why do you think, even though most genealogists don't have to go to school to become a genealogist, why do you think they separate it?
Right.
I hope that made sense.
Well, I think it's a lot of what you said, Donya, in the green room, which is it's just elitism, right? Like, there's no degree. You don't go to Harvard and get a genealogy degree, but you can go to Harvard and study history, or you can go to Howard and study history, but you can't go to Howard and study genealogy. Like, so I think it's the sort of cultural elitism we have. We make anything that's academic in the academy better. I mean, I have been refused grants because I don't have a PhD in history, even though I have done this kind of work professionally for every major institution and some of the most significant historical sites in the state of Virginia. But because I don't have that degree, academic institutions in particular don't give me the funding to do that kind of work. So it's the same sort of, I think that is what plays into this history and genealogy thing sometimes too. It's just this, well, you don't have a degree in it, or you don't have a certificate in it, or the way you get paid for it, if you get paid for it, is sort of like a freelancer. So it doesn't look, we don't have genealogists on staff. We should. Monticello should definitely have a genealogist on staff, but they don't. They have people that do the genealogy and they work with descendant communities, but they don't hire for that genealogy piece. And they should. Every major historical site should.
And we also joke about the fact, especially professional genealogists, we're almost like accountants, lawyers, and doctors. At I don't want to say at gatherings, at parties. Oh, you're a genealogist. Okay, and then all of a sudden it's free advice. As much as we love to help people, we kind of have to make a living. We kind of have to make a living too. I don't know if historians tend to get that. Maybe they do.
I don't know. People tend to find me really boring at parties because I'm like, when is this furniture from? And tell me about that painting and who's in that painting. How is that person? And people are like, oh, we don't care about any of that. So,
well, see, and that's just it. We actually have the same issues because there are a lot of people that actually don't want to know about family. They're like, oh, why are you going into this? Now I work at the DAR, and there was one guy who actually, when I first started working there, he said, so do you push your conversation to people about history? And I'm like, what do you mean? He was like, I mean, like, do you always talk about family history? He was like, because not everybody, wants to know that. And I was like, no, but if you ask me a question, I'm going to answer it. So you need to be mindful of what you're asking me as opposed to wondering if I'm going to push it. Because I'm not going to talk about it, first of all, to you, because you're not even my family. I don't even know how you're related to me. Or even if you're related to me, it's not even a thought. So I'm at a point now where I'm not going to I won't push anything on anybody. I have family members that don't want to hear this. So why am I going to push it on a stranger? And he did. They tend to,
I don't want to go to a party and learn about cars. And yet I seem to hear a lot about vehicles sometimes too. So like
exactly.
So Andi, what are some of the ways that I don't know that we can explore in terms of breaking down this perception between these tensions between, again, professional genealogists and historians? Although, can I just caveat that by saying, I'm sorry, it's almost as though I had someone speak in my headpiece. We have had because Donya, you have to agree, we've had amazing historians come on the show, and we have never felt any shade coming from them at all. So I just wanted to caveat that not all historians are like that.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and there's, I think it was at Oggs a few years ago, Ed Lay, who's a historian at the University of Richmond here in Virginia, came and did a talk about this. And basically, there's no reason to have it. And his point was, we're using the same resources, we're using the same oral histories, if the historian will allow oral histories, some don't. We're using the same data points, we're using the same documents, we're just using the same materials. We may interpret them differently or use them for different purposes, but we're using the same things. And so why not understand that that's how all historians do it, right? Like, I'm always interested in Black history. So I may look at a newspaper from 1905 and I'm going to look for the Black history. I'm going to be that person. But that doesn't mean that I'm not still doing history. So it's just a matter of, I think, broadening our perspective and saying, like, we're all doing the same stuff. We're just using it differently and interpreting it for different purposes.
And again, it's just another thing that sprang into my mind. It's not long after I moved down to DC. As you know, I started researching the descendants of the people known as the Weeping Time, who connect to the Gullah Geechee along the southeastern coast. And an author just reached out to me. He was writing a book with Dr. Henry Louis Gates about the Gullah Geechee, same community of people that I was actually writing about. And he was just really impressed with the work that all of us had done, including researchers who had been searching these people for far longer than myself. But anyway, they were asking me my goal, and I'm like, well, I've got the names of 31 of the 47 ships that the enslaving companies that I know who are responsible for the Africans even being here. It's like I've got most of them, and the author was floored. He's like, "You've got the advertisement?" I'm like, "Yeah, from the colonial newspapers. You just get it from I can't remember the name of the website. If I can remember it, I'll post it. Accessible Archives. That's what it's called. They have all the colonial South Carolina newspapers, and that's where I was finding these ships with the number of Africans, where they were coming from, who the ship captains were, when the auction was going to be, whether it was in Charleston or Beaufort or Barclay. And the author was stunned. Not only that, I actually gave it to him with all the links to all the papers that I had. And that helped him with his research. And the promise was made: if I find out anything more about these voyages, the ships, the logs, I will share it with you. He's like, that's the least I can do. It's like, because this helps my research.
Yeah. When Alan Miller was working on his book, which I just lost the title of, and it will come to me in a minute, but he wanted to find out about enslavement in Virginia. And Remo is one of those places that's a little bit like a plantation ghost town. Not much has changed. And so if you want to see a landscape, it's private. So don't take this as an invitation. I can't invite everybody to come, as much fun as that would be. But I got to take him out there. And he's an elite historian. I mean, he is like the top of his field. And he just wanted to hear what stories I knew. And it was heartening to me, personally, but also professionally, because I thought, here is someone who knows that there's more than what you can learn from paper, and that there's more than what you can learn from the scholars who have gone before you. And that's the same kind of thing. When he found some information, Brian, that he thought would be interesting for my research, he sent it to me. And as I found more that would be helpful to him, and there was no tension. There's still no tension. I run into him in the Special Collections Library at UVA all the time doing research. And we always just chat, because I think when people are true to really just wanting the truth and wanting the whole picture of history, then we're happy to get it from anybody.
Oh, and for Grace Miller, that archive is called Accessible Archives. I think it's .org. I'm going to say that if you visit it, and I will do my best to get the link, but if you do visit it, it is very expensive. So don't think in terms of newspapers.com or an Ancestry subscription. It is a subscription service, and you're knocking on the better part of $100 for it.
What did you call it again, Brian? Grace Archives?
Accessible Archives.
Okay.
So yeah, so those are certainly some ways. And there was a Facebook group for genealogists and historians. Is that still going, or has that been wrapped up?
That was Andi's Facebook group.
You mean mine?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, it's still there, and
so much.
Having this conversation makes me want to revive it. It's called our folks take now, because they can do more work. Thanks a lot. But it's fun work, and it's a nice way to kind of connect people across the disciplines. So, and somebody in the chat is talking about independent historians, which is what I am. I tend to be a little more connected. And there's a group here in Charlottesville called the Central Virginia History Researchers that's made up of academics and independent historians and genealogists and property owners and all kinds of people who are just looking into African American history in particular. And that's kind of the model that I would love to see everywhere, which is just people interested in finding out particular stories coming together and helping one another do it. So, and I see Shelley Murphy's in here. She's part of that group too.
Because again, for me, it's just an important conversation to have, because I can see all the different ways that historians and genealogists are either two sides of the same coin and can work together to help each other. So, specifically in terms of reaching a goal. And I go back to what I was saying at the top of the show. I just wish that more press and media would take what we do more seriously, and have us involved in terms of the stories, the articles, the news peoples, the online discussions, the TV discussions, the print discussions that they're having about various aspects of history.
Yeah, I mean, I think that I do hope that all the television shows that are out help. Like Skip Gates is doing a great job, even though I'm sure all of us could talk about the concerns we have sometimes about his findings, right? I see Donya's face.
I'm sorry.
But at least it's bringing genealogy into the forefront, right? Like it's people are talking about, or who do you think you are? I mean, what I do wish those shows would do is more what Genealogy Roadshow used to do, which is just sort of everyday normal people doing a little research and getting a little information and about their families. Like that kind of information, I think it only helps us. And if the way, I don't know that I want to create this kind of hierarchy, but if the way that people start to learn history in the broad sweeping strokes of movement and how life worked for people is through genealogy, that's awesome. And if history is the way people start to want to know their own family stories, I think that's awesome too. They're doing the same work. I just want us all to get along and do this work together.
Well, you actually reminded, cousin of mine said that I should have this as a t-shirt slogan. It's like, if genealogical research makes you uncomfortable and history doesn't, you're doing history wrong.
Yeah. History is not being taught.
Or the other way around, right?
Or the other way around, exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Because I can't.
Yep.
I mean, and I definitely hear you, Donya. There's a ton of people in the work that I do, and it depends on what their own particular experiences are, right? They sometimes don't want to know a particular part of their family's history. Because I work with enslaved people, they often don't want to know that, right? Like that's hard history. It's hard history to hold on to. But some people don't want to do 20th century history because they lived through civil rights or whatever other painful, traumatic experiences they lived through. And that's also okay. But it doesn't mean that the rest of us don't keep going. It just means we don't force it on people, like you said, Donya.
Mm-hmm. So I wondered, our time is running slow, but I'm gonna say this just real quick, and then everybody can kind of say something on the comments including you, Andi. So maybe we should force it in some type of degree to get the right history. I would love to know everybody's thought on that, because right now the history it's not wrong, but it's not correct either. So
my viewpoint has never changed. What we run from, we give energy and power to. The more this country refuses to discuss the less than admirable and sometimes outright horrific parts of its history, we just give power to it. And then we end up where we are at the moment.
Yeah. Well, Andi, I just want to thank you so very much for joining us. Once again, you've given us a great show. Once again.
Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you so much for joining us.
Brian, you want to talk about next week's show real quick?
My absolute pleasure.
My
screen has actually died, so would you?
Oh, sure. Okay.
Sorry.
So next week's show, we're going to talk about Black homesteaders in the Central Plains. We're going to be speaking with Dr. Richard Edwards and Jacob Freefeld, both who work with the Center of, I can't think of the name of it, but it's the Center of Midwest Plains, that's what it is. And they will be discussing about Black homesteaders in the Central Plains, something that we really don't talk about when we're talking about migration. When we talk about migration, especially for African Americans and for this particular show, we actually talk about the migration going northeast. We never talk about it going towards the west or in the Midwest, or what happened during that particular time period. So we want to give that some life, and
as well as the African Americans who were held by the 5 civilized tribes. So
exactly.
you guys have asked for it over the first couple of seasons about us to break out of our kind of Southeast bubble and kind of East Coast bubble. So you hopefully have noticed that we started doing that last season, and we're definitely carrying that on this season.
Yes. So I want to thank everybody for joining us today, and I just want to say again, thank you to Andi. You've enlightened us in every way, as always, and I'm very appreciative of you being on this show.
Yep. Thank you, Andi. Thank you, everyone at home, for spending the next hour with us. And you know where to find us every Sunday at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, right here on E360 TV, YouTube, and Facebook.
Exactly. All right, so we'll see you guys soon. Bye.
Bye.